Kick it off.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming to the panel honoring the lost. I think that there is a wide range of emotion, of history, of anticipatory stress regarding the missing and murdered Indigenous women and people overall that natives have carried, and then of course our neighbors, and hearing the stories and being with us also carry as well, especially when you have a range of unsolved missing, solved missing, but you know, unfortunately maybe have found deceased, homicide cases, unsolved homicide cases that are solved but are still in sentencing. So there's a wide range of things that are happening, and within Yakama, those numbers are very high. What I'll speak to for the most part is like the historical aspect of it, and then the community orientated aspect of how do you be in community and be a helpful person in what the families are requesting and needing, and how do you do that on a case-by-case basis. So our first reported case of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the term that we use now, was in 1855, a few months after the treaty signing in June. And this was a woman and a child and a baby in a cradle board that were killed by miners that were coming across Snoqualmie Pass and had stopped through Yakama lands on their way up to Colville. The widow of this woman and the father of those children was like, let's stop them. He actually got a friend from this area, which is related to the Auslander family, and was like, let's go find them and let's make sure that they don't continue this on anymore or do any other harm. And so they stopped them and killed those miners. The United States' response was a 3-year war. Mm-hmm. So they've never responded to that or revisited that decision, but that's what had happened. And I'll pause there in this historical moment, and we could shift over to other type of things.
George, would you want to share your story about both your mother and the work of healing that you are currently engaged in?
Real quick, as Emily had spoken about the Yakama War, October 5th of 1855 is when the Yakama Nation had its first battle against the U.S. Army. That battle is called or titled as the Battle of Toppenish Creek. You can look it up on your phone. That is the first time that the Yakama Nation went face to face with the adversary, the U.S. Army. We ended up winning that battle. The U.S. Army ended up scurrying away. They were then protected by what we understand as the Nez Perce Nation in their attempt to flee the Yakama warriors that were pursuing them. So that is a big battle that we highlight at the Toppenish Creek Longhouse, where I officiate, Sunday service, where I officiate, a lot of the funerals, memorials, name givings, first kill, first catch ceremonies that I take care of. But that is in long-term goals, big picture wise, when we speak of the reenactments and such of our big, battles, that is one of the focuses that I have in the future goal, in being able to reenact a ride that occurred when Kamaikin sent for help from those that lived up in this area, Chief Alhai's son, Kilchan. And so there's a warrior that rode to the Union Gap where, you witnessed that Memorial Rock position there. And that rider made contact with Kilchan, the rider there at that gap, and let the warriors know Kamaikin is getting close to surrendering. We need to hurry up and give him support. And so it was that battle, that ride that had taken place from Union Gap to Toppenish Creek, where the battle was taking place at, that ride, full speed, understanding, you're getting ready to meet an enemy for the first time in your life. Your people have no idea who these people are. And now we're riding to face them in battle for the first time ever. Once they got to the Battle of Toppenish Creek, that is when Major Aller ended up fleeing with his men. And so that is one of the main rides that I'm hoping long-term wise to be able to reenact for our people, to show them that courage that is felt in that moment of riding to a big battle as such. I want to thank each of you for being here, and I want to thank Emily for touching on that battle and where our missing and murdered had begun for our people. As was introduced or as was stated, I did 17 years of military service for our country. First 6 years I did were in the U.S. Air Force, and then the last 11 years were in the U.S. Army. While I was stationed in England, back in 2001 to 2004, is when my mother was killed. 9/11 had occurred, and then I deployed shortly after 9/11 had occurred. I came back from my deployment, and then that is when 2003, just after my second deployment, is when my mother was shot and killed in Seattle. During that time, I had to fly, I had to take emergency leave, obviously, but within our traditional way of life, within the traditional teachings that we practice there at the Toppenish Creek Longhouse, at the Toppenish Longhouse, Wapato, all the longhouses that we have a period of mourning and a period where we understand that the body must return back to Mother Earth. And when I was gone to England, understanding that teaching that our people carry, I understood, I was asked by my grandmother, do you want us to hold your mother up and wait for you to get home? Or do you want us to go ahead and move forward with the burial? That was the first decision I had to make, understanding missing and murdered had just now affected my family. I am now charged with the responsibility of deciding whether or not I want to see my mother before she is put away or not. I decided, understanding the teachings that I carried, that I did not want to hold my mother up. And so I let her go. And by the time I returned back from England, she was buried and put away. And so that was one of those instances where I understood our teachings must take precedence in order for healing to fully begin. Otherwise, we're going to end up standing in our own way, and our own way will prevent any growth from occurring within ourselves. And so that was, that major focus and that major understanding. Understanding that I was still serving in the military. Understanding that after I returned back from burying, or that service that occurred for my mother, that I was getting ready to deploy again for my third deployment after 9/11 had occurred. And so, it was a back-to-back thing with me when I had deployed. And so all of these things I had to, in a way you could say, either put away out to the side or allow grievance to take full course, and therein I can begin the healing process right after. And that was the path that I decided to take. Once I came back home for that part that I was able to mourn my mother, I went to the sweat house that we have, and I prayed about, everything that had taken place, understanding that I have to move forward, knowing that the killer of my mother was not captured. No one knows any idea who he is. No one knows why he killed my mom. No one knows why, these things just end up being, unsolved. And so pushing through my military service, that purpose of service began to grow within myself. Why am I serving? Why am I serving? Because I want to be able to allow influence to take hold after I'm done, so that I can therein serve in this sort of situation where I can bring voice for the benefit of the people, rather than perpetuating the negativity that has been perpetuated in our lands for some time now. And so healing, as I spoke to Mark's class a couple of days ago, has become a primary focus, not just for myself, but to allow that to perpetuate through me in a positive way, in a way that we can begin to heal and take care of what we understand as our heart, our body, and our spirit, so that we can move forward, and the things that we touch after are not influenced in a negative manner by those sorrows and sicknesses and pains that we do carry, angers and frustrations, the questions of why that enable, that perpetuate, how we move forward with our life. And so, going through what I had gone through as, the missing and murder topic, we come here to discuss, it's a painful one. My mother's murder still remains unsolved, but I don't want that to hinder any growth that I might be able to hold for myself, or as well, the children that I have that follow behind me. I don't want to hinder their growth at all as well either. I want them to understand what it is that we are doing our best to stand up and speak for, advocate for, and so that we can begin to be that change that we are hoping we could see in our community.
Thank you.
Mark.
So I bring greetings from my students at American University who have been working with Emily and with and other members of the family and the community in attempting to give some historical contextualization to one of the cases we'll be discussing of Atwai Bassett, who was recently quite miraculously, as Emily will explain, identified with a Jane Doe, and with the help of George and the whole family, was then brought back home last month. But I also bring greetings from my colleague, Gabrielle Tayak, whose work many of you know. She was a founding director of the National Museum of American Indian and has been pondering the time depth of everything we're talking about, a 500-year history. Of course, Columbus's diaries commemorate that from the very moment that his ships landed on, seems to have been Dominica, of course, Taino women, many of them children, were forcibly conscripted into sexual slavery. Many of them died, others were taken back to Spain. And also Dr. Tayak's own, I believe, is his 7th great grandmother, Mary Kitamakwan, as some of you know, was heir to the major lands that are now Washington, D.C. and the surrounding Chesapeake within the Piscataway Confederacy. And she was forcibly married under enormous pressure from the new Catholic leadership of the Maryland colony that sought to secure land claims. She was forcibly married between the ages of 8 and 10 to Giles Brent, was then taken back to England, came back again, had a number of children, and then died at a young age. So she too is part of this very long story that we ponder of that missing and murdered Indigenous women that obviously came to the fore here in the mid-19th century, has a very, very deep time depth. And she was targeted precisely because of her land claims. At the center of her important lands were the lands that George Washington then acquired, and that became the 5 farms of Mount Vernon. So the community likes to think of her as one of our many founding mothers. We talk a lot about our founding fathers, but these lands, which were expropriated from her, this is a community, of course, in which land and wealth and title would descend through women, and then was eventually taken over by the extended family of Lord Calvert to become part of the Commonwealth of Maryland. But the history of that land, the land on which our nation's capital is built, is the story of an early missing Indigenous woman who died a premature death and whose land was then expropriated to create the nation's, ultimately the nation's capital. So it's just, I think it's good for us to remember her and to honor her and so many others. And do you want to speak a little bit about the Atwai Bassett story?
Yeah, so I will explain what Atwai means. It means like a loved one that's passed on. And typically in our culture, we don't say their name after we bury them for a period of time until there's a memorial. In instances where there's MMIP cases or ongoing cases, that's very difficult, right? Because there's ongoing investigations, requests and questions. Sentencing, even trials. And so one of the ways that we do that is some families will just say the Atwai and then their last name. And so in this instance where her missing person case is closed, but her homicide case is still open, that's what we're moving forward with. Unless the family says otherwise, but that's it's a case by case basis, but in the 1950s, there is a woman that lived in Wapto, which is a rural area, just like 45, depending on how fast you drive, minutes from here, 50 minutes. And also, you know, where George Lee's mother and grandmother lived, that attended high school there, was involved in a number of different activities, and after graduation decided to become a part of the federal relocation program. This was a type of assimilation program, to be seen as, you know, in order to immerse yourself in culture of American and Western civilization, you should leave the reservation. You should go get a job. You should only make enough to live and not even enough to have a call back to your family. Like, these are the federal written policies that are legitimately a part of this. You know, so she had moved to Chicago, had some time there, and was very independent by nature. Sometimes wouldn't return calls to her brother, and at some point, you know, it became very worrisome that something had happened and they weren't able to get a hold of her. So since 1968, the family has been looking for her, sending out requests and prayers. I first found out about her in 2023. And that's when I was able to find a yearbook photo of her. And there was nothing else I could find. I couldn't find a missing person report. I couldn't find a file number. I just like kind of hit a dead end. And I won't put an asterisk on that, and that's where Mark comes in, but I'll revisit that dead end in a second. I went there for work in February, and the family again had said, like, hey, can you just say prayers for her? And I was like, I'm one person. I'm not a law enforcement. I'm not any administrator in this official capacity. But that's what I went around and did. I went around the whole city and just prayed for her. And I kept saying, like, your family wants to bring you home. And I went to I still call it like the Willis Tower, because that's what it was originally called. It's called, or the Sears Tower, but it's called something else now. But the highest point in Chicago, and it's all glass. If you haven't been to Chicago or been in that area, so you can go around and see the whole city in all glass. And so I was like, well, this is going to be easier than me walking around Chicago, Seattle too, but walking around Chicago. And I just had said the same thing over and over. And then in May, we found out that there was a Jane Doe in Will County, which is about an hour and 30 minutes away from Chicago, depending on traffic. And that she might have had Yakama ties. And is there anybody that knows of a missing woman that was from Yakama in the 1960s? And so I had contacted the people. I had to vet them through when, and if Ace is able to come here, he'll describe some of the vetting processes, because unfortunately with these cases and missing and murdered Indigenous people, you have to have a level of checks on certain people that are reaching out or asking, because there are things that exist where people aren't official, or they're not acting in an official capacity, or it's not a pathway that you'd want to pursue. So we did all of those, but that was in this past spring, and then we were able to bring her home and put her back to rest last month. And that was a large community effort to be a part of. And then the asterisk where I hit a end of the rabbit hole kind of thing is like, we couldn't find out a lot of information about like where she worked or verify it. We still couldn't find a missing person report. And when you're I have a high respect for authority. I was raised, as a latchkey kid in the 80s. So you're like, okay, whatever they say, just do it, So it's very uncomfortable for me to talk to a police officer and have them, or a detective or an investigator, and multiple times have them say, we've never been trained for this. We've never been trained for an instance where there's no missing person report number, and we have a Jane Doe that could be a match. There's no training that exists for this because this is not supposed to happen. And unfortunately, what we see with missing and murdered Indigenous women and people is that's exactly the pathway that so many families are in, where we have to, we're put in these dynamic where things that aren't supposed to happen are happening. And so now what do you do with it and how do you move forward with that? So where Mark comes in is, you know, we discussed this and talked about it, and then he has amazing research capabilities, and he types till 3 a.m. sometimes looking for and through things, and he doesn't stop. And you know, I don't know how many pages, 180.
I have a lot of hard work, so.
Yeah.
So, Emily kindly, Hope and I have had the privilege of working with Emily and other community members for a long time. So this seemed, as she explained to us and to my students, that there was need for research to understand that at this point, the family with George Lee was preparing to travel and wanted as much contextualization as they could to understand as much of her life as possible. So the students got together. These are the students, Sydney and Morgan, Dacia, Lady, and Anna, and they got to work putting together a larger timeline especially in terms of national Indian policy leading to the termination after World War II, leading reorganization. It's a complicated story. Maybe we'll come back if there's time. But they tried to contextualize what was happening politically, what they prepared. That very summer that Waibasa became lost to her family was a period of enormous political tumult associated, among other things, with the rise of not only the Democratic National Convention, but of course the rise of Red Power in Minnesota, which my students think she just might have been present for. So they tried to look at the complex relationship between the racialization of urban politics in the 1960s, the rise of Red Power and the American Indian movement, and the life trajectory of why. It turns out that although she seems to have been ordered, as far as we can tell from the paperwork, not to have anything to do with African Americans, and while she paid rent for 8 years up at the Sheridan Park Hotel, which many of us know from research in the Uptown region of Chicago, she also kept a residences on the south side of Chicago, in the middle of one of the most thriving African American communities, and was living just near the location, as it happens, of the famous 1961 Chicago American Indian Conference that my students have been accessing. This was a different world, shall we say, than what was to come in 1968 with the founding of AIM. This was a very creative, in collaboration with the anthropology department. An anthropology department that, as many of you know, which I attended, was deeply resented and loathed, I would say, by most Native activists because of its work in excavating or plundering important burial mounds in Illinois. But my teacher, Saltax, was trying to do reparative work and brought in over 460 Native activists. And this led to a declaration of Indian principles. And my students have been wondering if she was living right there. She seems to have been around. She seems to have known people who were involved. But it seems likely this was as Emily mentioned, we know that there was conscious attempts by the Field Employment Office of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to push for full assimilation, but there were, from an early date, after she arrived in 1957, we know that there were Native American canoeings, the get-togethers that became powwows and so forth. We now know, thanks to the documents we were all able to obtain from the National Archives in Chicago, the BIA employment records, that she was working at Western Union. She was one of many young Native women recruited to be teletype operators. Students have been fascinated by trying to put together her life in Uptown, which called itself, of course, Chicago's American Indian Village. We assume these were offices that she would have visited, although they often complained she didn't come in enough. And from the BIA standpoint, and the St. Augustine Center, just a couple doors away from where she lived, and the students were sent. The students also, Emily encouraged them to explore all aspects of her full and complex life, including the type of music she might have listened to. And the students did think, based on where she was living in Bronzeville, she quite likely would have listened to Etta James, there's some wonderful. They thought particularly the song "Tell Mama" that if we have time, perhaps we might play. They're just telling off certain men, so a woman can run her whole life. So they created a mixtape. They've been pondering the disjuncture in addresses. Sorry to move on through all these different locations. Their clear connection with the Catholic Church, living on when she wasn't in Uptown, down in at the Sheridan Park Hotel location, it's a beautiful building. They see that something changed and we don't understand, but there are reports that illness came in. There is a strange document in the BIA records. Students were very upset talking about this, that she was accused by a white Chicago Transit Authority conductor of threatening to scalp him. Some elders have suggested to us that this is the sort of thing that happened when Indigenous women resisted the advances of white men. They would be accused of being violent. She was locked up for 17 days, apparently in Bridwell, which is Chicago's jail, but we find absolutely no record of any trial or conviction. So she was probably held and then released, and then life seems to have gotten much harder. And so much we don't know about what happened in the summer of '68, but there's this little hint that our students are fascinated by. The police did go in a reluctant way. They obviously made clear that the searching for Native women was not high on their priorities. But this fascinating thing, if I can just jump forward, is when we go to the very sad story of the recovery of her mortal remains, perhaps 2 days after her death, along Interstate 55. And by a remarkable coincidence, that is just in the shadow of the most important series of Indigenous burial mounds in northern Illinois. And we like to think that somebody may have been looking after her during this horrible time. But this other little mystery, I'll just move beyond, sorry for just jump back to this, is that the one thing her brother could remember when he was trying to find her, and this is already the fall, is that she had contacted him from a place called something Wells. It might have been Indian Wells in Minnesota. And this is only speculative by my students that just offer this as a possibility. There is an Indian Wells trail in White Bear Lake in Ramsey County, Minnesota. That's a little bit north of the Twin Cities. And it is an important Dakota community, and many Dakota people from right there we know did come to Chicago under federal relocation. It would have been in Uptown. So this is speculative, perhaps, Emily. George, we don't know. The students wonder if she might have traveled back, and if so, she would have been in the Minneapolis area in the summer, July of 1968, when AIM was formed, and which so many experiences happened. But somehow there's no confirmed sighting of her after, I believe, early June of 1968, up until and then up until so we have many mysteries. And I know the students are honored to work on this project and hope to begin to continue collaborative work, perhaps records requests will yield more. As we try to figure out where she might have been, where she might have traveled, and how her trajectory may have taken her through this remarkable process of transformation within the movement for Native American rights. Here's a famous picture, many of you know, from July 29th, 1968, in which AAM came together. Sorry, and then we move on to the memory. The students are also deeply interested in Moved In. George kindly shared with our students some of the stories of his healing journey, and the continuing struggle to honor and remember his mother on the streets of Seattle.
Can I, on that note, and going to George, I know there was some questions before the panel came up about what is collaborative community, like what does that mean? And Mark gives us really fancy words for like things that we're just raised to do. Like I was like, oh, that sounds really fancy. Yes, we are a collaborative community, rather than just like doing it because your elders asked or something, you know, which also is fancy, but in a different way. But George Lee, I was wondering if you could talk about the motorcycle escort, and then maybe also what's coming up in November.
So Otway Bassett has a niece, and the brother that is referred to, the one that would go out and search for his sister, the older brother, is one of the daughters that attends Sunday service at the Toppenish Creek Longhouse, where I officiate. And so her name is Mary Ann Bassett, and she's the niece of Otway Bassett. She is a member of the Yakama Nation Veterans Day Celebration and Powwow Committee, you know, understanding that her son, Asa, who would as well supposed to be here, he served in the 82nd Airborne, you know, he's part of the 82nd and served in the Army. And so Mary Ann Bassett became part of the Yakama Nation Veterans Day Celebration and Powwow Committee to honor him and to honor her father, Wat Bassett. So Mary Ann Bassett, being a longtime member of the Powwow Committee, we started talking about how we as a community or as a committee would network outward. Just so happened, as I was doing some work for a motorcycle club, they're called the Savages Motorcycle Club, they came to one of these meetings that we started talking about Otway Bassett. And so I'd mentioned to the motorcycle club as is their goal to advocate for missing and murder just the same. Mentioned them the opportunity that had risen for them to be able to advocate for MMIP in a much bigger picture than they have been, so that they can therein comfort the family and comfort, you know, as well the community that understands what is going on as missing and murdered. And so one of the meetings that they had attended, I offered the that opportunity for them, not necessarily an opportunity because this is a very sad incident, but the availability that was there for them to escort our loved one. And so when Asa and Emily and Holly flew over to Chicago, we began making that understanding of when she could possibly come back into come back into Washington State. And so understanding the jurisdictions that have to be transferred between for our Otway Bassett to come from Chicago to not only King County, but also to come through Kittitas County and then go through and finally make the resting place there at Yakama County. We had so many jurisdictions that we had to overcome and see through, so that communication between us and the Savages and the escort that was to happen, it became a bit of a challenge, understanding that there's no said window of exactly when she'll be here, but she'll be here roughly about this time. And so the Savages Motorcycle Club, you know, they understood that. And so they were basically on a 3-window period of when they would be escorting. And so the time didn't show. We had a more understanding about 20 hours, 24 hours prior. But that window had to be there and dwindled down to 6 hours prior when we actually fully understand when that escort needs to be ready. And so the Savages Motorcycle Club, you know, they have multiple chapters, one over in the west side, one over here on the east side, and they're trying to expand as well. But they also have chapters all throughout the country, you know, just the same. And so the Savages Motorcycle Club, you know, once we were able to finally narrow down when that timeline was going to move forward for our Atwai Bassa to have that transfer from King County to Yakama County, you know, all of the bikers were lined up and ready to go as soon as we finally got that word. And so the Savages Motorcycle Club, you know, they wish to expand their ability to serve the community in a missing and murdered capacity. And so last year when we have our Veterans Day Celebration and Powwow Committee that will be putting on a Veterans Day powwow to recognize not only the veterans, but the gold stars that have lost someone that has served, and as well blue stars and the families of those that are currently serving today. And so the Savages Motorcycle Club is putting on a missing and murdered special for this year's event. Last year, this missing and murdered special was put on by Bree Blackhorse, who is the Attorney General of the West Region, prosecutor of the West Region for the missing and murdered. For, you know, when we talk about California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Idaho, you know, Montana, Colorado, I believe is, you know, all of those states where Bree Blackhorse prosecutes for missing and murdered cases. And so it was Bree Blackhorse and her husband that put on the missing and murdered special last year. This year it will be the Savages Motorcycle Club that will be stepping in and taking care of that missing and murdered special that we'll be having. And as well, they'll be providing security for our powwow, our celebration and powwow, so that they can therein begin to allow that community to feel that blanket, I guess, we're trying to establish over the community, so that the community can understand that the realization of the depths of how much the Savages wish to be there for the community, you know. And so Savages Motorcycle Club, as I said, they're wishing to expand their MC. And so they've offered, you know, me the opportunity to start a chapter there with the Yakama Nation and becoming that Yakama Nation chapter for the Savages MC there on the reservation, which has been getting a lot of feedback, you know, understanding that there are a lot of threats that, as Emily had mentioned, there are a lot of cases that are stuck in that waiting for the prosecution date, waiting for the sentencing date, and that intimidation stance that occurs within our people, you know, that feel pressure from those that they have to make testimony, whether it be against the individual or the family itself. Families as well feel that pressure, you know, you better not say anything about my family, you know, type of thing that is, you know, perpetuated there on the reservation. And so one of the focuses of that motorcycle club or Savages is to be able to step in the way of that and be able to allow those testimonies to come out in a more, you could say, solid manner, where there's not so many spaces or gaps in the stories or in a testimony that will delay prosecution of those that are awaiting their trials.
I did just want to mention one thing and ask a question and then open it up to questions and comments from all of you. So many of our students and colleagues here are deeply committed to bioarchaeology, to to the intersection of archaeology and osteological research, and that turned out to be extremely important in this project. And I know many of us have been very critical of some of the work that the Museum Conservation Institute at the Smithsonian, where I used to work, has been involved in, which has involved in some cases historically, of course, deep assaults on Indigenous graves, on the ancestral remains of Native and African American peoples. But I must say, in this case, they do seem to be behaved with great integrity and played a very important role in moving this case forward. They can't share all of the data with the family yet because there's Asa. Yeah, great.
Asa's
Okay.
navigating the parking of Central Washington University.
Louisa, the Native American liaison with the State Attorney General's office, is of course central to this story. I did just want to ask, in terms of this, if you just tell us a little bit about riding, because that story is so beautiful. And as you spoke about the escort riding on the bikes, I was thinking of the proud and remarkable history of the warrior horse riders of the Yakama Nation and of other Sahaptin-speaking peoples, in which riding was obviously important from a military and economic standpoint, but wasn't it also an important spiritual undertaking, and to ride and move across the landscape? Apparently, it was the most remarkable thing to see a group of riders come over the hill or through the valley. I was so struck by that idea of riding and that long history of horse riding that now the savages are continuing.
There's one of the awesome things when I had spoke about that ride from Union Gap to the Battle of Toppenish Creek. The reason that sticks so out there to me is because when we were in Afghanistan, or when we were in Iraq, or when we were in Africa, or when we were in Australia, and the point I'm making is that when we were those soldiers on aboard the whether it be the Chinook helicopter or the Black Hawk helicopter, we had that sense that we felt when we were riding to meet the enemy. We understand that whenever we hit the ground, 90% of the time we're going to make contact with the enemy just like that. And so when it comes to the riding essence and that battle, that ride that took place from the Union Gap to the Battle of Toppenish Creek, and that sense of, aliveness that you feel, understanding you're about to meet the enemy, you're this close, and whether or not you're better or not than them is going to prove itself, in the task that you're able to prove and the skill that you carry. And so that oneness as well with the land that we speak about when we talk about, that oneness with the horse, and so that was one of those feelings that always stood out to me, and understanding that how those warriors had felt in the battle, riding from the Gap to the Battle of Toppenish Creek, and that oneness that was necessary between the warrior and the horse. And so, and now that Asa's here, we're going to give him a chance to talk.
I can just really quickly catch Asa. So Asa is what we would traditionally call the grandson of a Twi Bassett. There might be other Western terms that we use, but in our way, the siblings of our grandparents are also acknowledged as our grandparents. And he was a very big important part of the DNA process, and actually confirming that it was a match. So we haven't talked about really any of that yet, Asa, if you want to dive in, or you talk about MMIPs broadly.
Okay. Hey, Chef Patroy, good afternoon. One name is just Tilly Wanu, and my name is Tilly Wanu. My English name is Washines. Yeah, man, you gotta catch those ferries. Like, gotta get there early. I'm just coming back from a village up Northwest Indians. They had their annual convention in Suquamish. So that's on a Clearwater, Port Madison reservation. We gotta catch a ferry, and so that's. I would have been here if it was on time. And so, yeah, I was listening about halfway through, about half hour ago. So I was listening to the conversation. So appreciate the time of all of you guys doing all this work. It's kind of a lot to take in, there's so many aspects to this work, especially on a case by case basis. Everyone's unique. And so this started with like Emily talked about, her going to Chicago and then just gradually getting more information over time. And then at one point, it has to do a DNA test, and as tribal members, we don't like to do that fast. But we did it, and then we kind of forgot about it. I did it, and then my mother did it. And then so that's how it all began, was through a DNA test. Which is new technology. It's something we didn't have even 10 years ago. And so it's been things happen so fast, but it takes time for happen. It takes time for it to happen so fast. Next thing you know, we're on a flight to Chicago with Emily and then Holly. And then just kind of we went through all the emotions of all of that. Yeah, there's so much to say. There's so many nuances that families don't think about, law enforcement don't think about, coroner's office don't think about. And so I'm glad Emily took notes to the whole process, because we can really highlight these areas where it needs to be worked on: communication, documentation, talking with families, and so there's so many points that we just touched that, well, let's figure it out. And so we did. And so really it's like one thing at a time, what's in front of me. And really with technology, and the cold casing it. So in Washington State, we created the first ever cold casing. There's 4 investigators, the lead supervisor, and there's a family navigator. And this is the first in the country that kind of looks at the total number of homicides in Washington State that involves Indigenous victims. And so their task is to help local law enforcement assist in some of this review of these cases. And so it's been active about a year. They even help out, assist with the FBI cold cases. And so they're really, they're working. I can say that we helped file charges on an individual from a 2016 case from a cop. And so this was a cold case of wood carver. He's married into Macaw. His daughter's Macaw, but he's from the First Nation up in Canada. And so we're able to file charges on the person that murdered him. And so that case is going on over on the coast. And so that, things like that we're able to do now because of technology and DNA testing that we haven't done before. And so when it came to this case, like Emily said, hey, Brian, figure this out. What's the jurisdictional issues? Like, what's it mean to transport back? Do we need to call the BIA to help us transport back? Like, what's the permitting process? What's that look like? And I thought I almost had to go to Chicago and by train come back home, because in Washington State, if you flying someone home, they need to be involved. And so our relative wasn't conditioned to be involved. And so, oh man, I got to take a train back from Chicago. Like, and it was a lot, but it was a process, but we're able to really do it the right way. So, yeah, I know I'm here to end it, but
So could we ask you, this is really from my students who were following and trying to give as much help as they could, but they were so moved to know that the family was visiting places that she had been. And I believe at the end of the day, you did have time to go to Foster Beach, to the shores of Lake Michigan, near where she had lived, and probably the beach where she would have looked out at the water many times. Could you just tell us a little bit about what it was like after that very long and challenging period to have the time being at the water?
no, it was a long day for sure. We met the folks. We did the ceremony at the mortuary, at the funeral home. But then early on, I thought, like, well, we should reach out to the Chicago Indian community. I had some friends that lived in Chicago previously, and they always talked about Chicago Indian Center. And so I figured I'd reach out to them. You know, and the country's pretty small, and so Abigail Echohawk, she, you know, she's a huge advocate for this work, and so she knew the person that ran the tour from Northwestern in the area, and so I connected with her, and talked about what's going on, and I said, you know, it's probably a good idea if we can come out there and meet with you guys, and maybe like a small service like a potluck or something, and they're open to that. And so Chicago has like one of the largest urban populations in the country just because of the relocation program. And so, and I know it's last minute, but there's a handful of people that came out, showed out to the park. There's one of the elder ladies that suggested we go to the park because we almost went to a clinic and then the new Chicago Indian Center. But she's like, the elderly lady was like, well, she probably came out here to this beach at some point, just because that's where we do other ceremonies. They do other sunrise ceremonies, they do other gatherings at that park, and so I thought it was good. I brought my bell, and so just did a small little service. I never been out to Lake Michigan. It's, I don't know, it's huge. It's like looks
Even
like,
the insects.
yeah.
Even all the insects.
You can hear the chirps. I don't know what they're. Yeah. So it was just,
Yeah.
cicadas. It was a good little, you know, we did a small prayer service and said our words, and so that was, I think it's good for the community. Yeah, and we, you know, share some food, some words, and so I think that kind of topped it off. You know, I think, you know, closed that chapter for her there and opened her next chapter on her way.
Yes.
You know, so definitely.
So would it be all right if people shared questions or comments? I know some people have to go to the next event. There's a lot happening on campus, so please feel free to go. Need to be elsewhere, but those who can stay and would like to clarify points or share your observations or just share what's on your heart as we're having these very challenging and important conversations. We also have some people coming in, I think from around the country, who may have questions as well. I think this Chris, I can.
Not yet, but as they come in,
Okay.
I will check and see. So people on Zoom, go ahead and if you'd like to write in the chat, and I'll ask a question for you.
Yes, please.
I'd like to ask George, is your mother buried somewhere on the reservation or like in the reservation cemetery?
My mother is buried at what is called a Methodist Church Cemetery. That's right outside White Swan, Washington.
Okay,
So she was killed in Seattle, listed as a homeless person. My grandmother found that extremely offensive because she was not homeless. But she was brought back home to the reservation and buried right next to her family.
okay. The reason I ask is my folks are at the reservation cemetery and I wanted to, if your mom was there, I wanted to go by and honor her.
Right down the road.
Yeah,
Several more
yeah.
miles. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking today. I have been following, sorry if I don't say it correctly, story since she was identified. So happy she was able to make it home and that she's from so far away. I was wondering if you'd speak more to Indigenous people not liking to have their DNA done, and if you believe that'll hinder the whole case and Native identification of Jane Doe's and Don Doe's.
Yeah, you know, and this goes back to this cultural practices of who we are, where we come from, and part of the understanding is, you know, we came here and into this world as a full body, and so we should lead the same way. And so oftentimes, you know, in the past, I've seen elders, you know, maybe they had to get their leg amputated, but they kept that leg with them until like, hey, that's going to go with me when I get buried. And so even DNA, it's the same mindset. You know, we take our hair with us when we pass, we put it in the casket with us. And so it's just that mindset of this is ours. We need to remain whole as we enter this road the same way we leave this road. So that's one mindset behind the DNA testing. If you go back to Kennewick Man, the ancient one, that was a huge controversy because none of the tribes wanted to do DNA testing. We just knew that it was our relative. One tribe decided to submit DNA, which just confirmed what we always said, that it was our relative. So, so it is, but nowadays, moving forward, I really believe, like, sharing this story through DNA testing, how it could be done culturally appropriate. We did get the DNA testing back from the company down in Texas that did it, and so that was a part of, into the casket. So there's ways we can do it now that are more culturally appropriate. We can maybe help solve some of these cases.
Othram is the company that Ethan mentioned as well, which we heavily vetted them during the process as well.
You talked about the challenges in terms of the different legal jurisdictions, and I was wondering if you could anyone could talk a little bit more about how that impacts these cases, specifically that there's different jurisdictions on the nation, for the US, for state, county, and how that creates these kinds of challenges for following up on these cases.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the original jurisdiction. There's a Supreme Court case that talks about land status, and I think it's McGurk, where the crime committed here versus where it's reported there, and even though that's a short distance, the land status has an effect on the original jurisdiction of where a homicide took place, and so if it's tribal land, reservation land, trust land, the feds have the authority. If it's off reservation, if it's on the reservation, but it's not trust land, is it state land, is it county land? And so it goes back to the original jurisdiction and trying to figure that out. In some counties, in some parts of the states, like overall, there's good working relationships and there's bad. And where it's bad, it's very difficult to get partnerships, with the county, with the state, with the feds in some areas. In some areas, it's really good. They have that, cooperative agreements, the MOUs between the county and the tribe on jurisdiction. Luckily, in Washington State, for the most part, it's a good working relationship between law enforcement and the feds and the state. There is, questions sometimes, but for the most part, it's good. And because we built those working relationships, I have the opportunity to call like the BIA investigator and like have them help out on a case. Like, hey, his name's Rico. Hey, Rico, can you look into this? What's going on? Or hey, State Patrol, this is what's going on. Well, tell me what can we tell the families? And so it's just it varies from this, and it's unfortunate. It has to be built on relationships. This should be the law, but it's not the case sometimes. And so it varies a lot.
Well, I would also ask George Lee to talk about the fact that his mother's case is not digitized yet has also impacted the ability for the Attorney General's office and all their cold case to even help. So, and officially that request has to come for the lead jurisdiction. And so far that request has been unresponded to. So like being, I don't want to speak for you.
She was doing so good.
Yeah. Earn your offer.
So, as she has said, my mother's case is not digitized. I started speaking more heavily to the investigator, cold case investigator out of Seattle PD. And they could not find my mother's case for the longest time. They had to go into the old cold case where everything was still written, nothing was put in computers yet. And that's where they finally found my mother's case. Obviously, because nothing has been put in digitally, those those things, perhaps such as grants, if I were to try to put in a grant request to help support, the investigation of my mother's case, would not be able to be complete because that case is still in their digital realm, non-existent. And so everything with my mother's case, is still, paper filled out. The investigator mentioned that everything is still utilized on that carbon paper. And so some of that carbon paper has been damaged as well. And so these are the issues that I'm finding with my own mother's investigation. And so that's part of where, those battles of jurisdiction that you had asked about, where those things fall in, when it comes to trying to push that case up to get more attention through ASA's level, as he works with the Attorney General of the state of Washington, that won't be possible just yet, only because of that simple fact. And that's really sad to understand that majority of the cases that are, 20 plus years old are stuck in that same exact mode. And that's nationwide, not just the city of Seattle.
Yes.
I was wondering, between the time that did they officially let you know when she was discovered in Juliet? And towards, you take that aside, when did they finally decide to do the DNA on this cold case that they had in Chicago?
No, we would never.
Yeah, so they have had 2 cold case units on this, what was called the 1968 Jane Doe. So that's all she was known as until
She was
May.
found in 68.
Yes,
And they
June 30th, 1968. But because law enforcement claims, we're not sure we believe this, that no missing persons report was filed, the police are saying, well, the sheriff's office is saying, well, how could we know it was her?
And this is Chicago Police Department, so Juliet's different.
But I mean, they had done DNA on her before though, but for Chiapas and not Native.
So they had done DNA on her 2 different times.
Oh, 2 times.
Yeah, 2 different times. And the first one was and some sketching from Smithsonian. And then the next time that they did it, they started to reach out to actually a woman in Pennsylvania that was an adoptee that didn't know who her father was. And because sometimes adoptees will put their DNA into systems, Othram, because they're just really good at their job, can find matches like that of distant relatives. They can't say how that particular person is related. They just know she's a distant relative. She was the first one that came up as a distant relative to Twy Bassett. And she was in Pennsylvania and she didn't know who her father was before last year. So Othram helped track down her dad, helped do other DNA with cousins. And that's where they were able to say she's from some Northwest tribe. Yakamas don't have enough DNA in their system. A lot of tribes don't. So we're still very much a mystery to them. They can, and they probably will just say we're a distant relative if it's a tribal member. And so that's where they were at. And they had no leads because they don't know how a Bassett is related to a Washines. They don't have that like working knowledge of that kind of stuff. And again, they don't know how to work when there's no missing person report and a Jane Doe, because those in theory have to always exist. So they went and did all the Shiapu or the non-native people that had missing person reports and excluded them. So there's like long lists of what they call exclusion lists, excluded, because they originally had written down that she was white.
Well, so what I can't understand, how did they do the magic or the IAS Chiapas, they come along and say, hey, let's do a Native American test.
I can speak a little bit to that. Some of this has not been released because it's still an ongoing cold case. The various scientists involved are under some restrictions. But the Smithsonian apparently, in addition to just doing visual descriptions, was able to pursue stable isotope analysis, which does now give them a pretty good sense of water and oxygen to which she had been exposed in life, in early life, which also pointed to the Pacific Northwest. And I think Chris or Pat or some of my colleagues here will understand better the underlying science, but that was what Dr. Francis' team at the Smithsonian Conservation Institute was able to establish, which does seem to have helped when, and of course, the DNA, as I think Ace has mentioned, has gotten more and more sophisticated, the genomic analysis that's possible. So all those different things have to converge with also a lot of pretty clever genetically informed forensic genealogy.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really quite remarkable that all those
FGG.
pieces came together.
There's some things we don't agree on with how they. The IAF Shiakus, sometimes they classify things, so they'll say like, could be Asian or Native, we're like, she was Native, we're not having, you know, according to their records or whatever, or anthropologically, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, Pat. Sorry, Carissa, but you know, sharing an ocean doesn't make us exactly one people. So, you know, yes, there are more things that anthropologically we can say are something, but there are still so many blind spots because they don't understand the communities and they don't understand the community connections. So it takes community plus technology plus scientists together, in particular to solve her case.
You know, and right
Missing
now,
person case.
currently in Washington State, we have over 110 unidentified individuals in Washington State, which is held by Washington State Patrol Labs. Once we found, as a MMIWP task force, once we found out about that, we're like, how can you tell anybody that you have this, say, backlog and not doing anything? Oh, well, we didn't know how much. And so last year, the task force recommended $500,000 for testing, DNA testing and FGG testing to start identifying these remains. And I think right now, State Patrol Lab was able to identify at least 40 so far. And they're still going through that, do the FGG testing. And that's how, yeah, because, and then that thing we're running into is what he's talking about is like, you know, we have a group of missing relatives, but there's no, like, how do we go to a community like, hey, there's no DNA to match them with, there's no backlog to, and so that's a problem we're coming with. And so our office working with the cold casing is trying to figure out a way to, maybe we have a couple individuals that are missing last 30 years. Let's see if they're open to DNA testing and see if we can maybe make a match with what we have with those unidentified. And so we're trying to figure out ways, and there's a really a person-to-person engagement that needs to happen to ensure that there's trust, because, you know, as the AG's office or state patrol office coming to you, hey, we need to do something, like, it's not going to work, you know. And so there's challenges as we go into each community and they're trying to identify, you know, hey, we might have, and see, that's the thing, it's, you know, we have this unidentified, and we want to do testing. What we need to do is match up the Jane Doe profile, match it up as much as we can to some of these cold case cases, you know, and try to, like, but see, in our case, there was no report for it. That's why, you know.
Yeah, but in hindsight, it still feels, you know, these records, these BIA records indicate that the police said they were filing a report. And then the very fact that your grandmother was recovered right along Interstate 65, which comes direct, the Stevenson Expressway, which comes directly out of that part of Chicago, it just seems hard that no one thought to make that connection in the investigation.
My aunt, so there's like 3 generations. You know, my grandfather, Wab, and he had a daughter, Elena. She's also a twin. My aunt Elena, she passed away. But for a period of time, she was writing letters to Chicago PD. And so she was married, formerly married to you know, my uncle Kelsey, who was also law enforcement at Tribal, and he was telling me that, yeah, I remember your Aunt Lena writing letters to Chicago PD, writing letters to whoever she could and getting no response. And so he remembers instinctively, like maybe in the 80s and 90s, like she tried for years and got nothing. And so and he kind of chuckled because it was in the wrong jurisdiction. But she just, my aunt didn't know, but she just wrote to like the county south of, you know,
One county,
Chicago.
one county south of him. Hope you had a question?
Sorry, was more of a, it's not very well formed. But hearing, I'm deeply moved by, so many of the things that you all shared today. But I'm particularly struck by this sort of idea of having culturally appropriate DNA testing. And I don't teach students that kind of, you know, thing. I'm not that kind of anthropologist, but it, you know, in terms of thinking about, you know, how we're teaching young people and just all students really, how to be, you know, professionals out there and how to take care. You know, I don't know if you all have any advice for those of us who are thinking about how to prepare our young people so that whenever they go to work for places like Pilgrim, you know, they've got their listening ears on. And they've got their hearts and their care out there, and they understand. You know, I it just seems like that's something that is a responsibility maybe that we have. So I don't know if anybody has any ideas or comments or thoughts.
You know, what's awesome is when Asa had mentioned Indian world is small. It made me think about, I just sent a letter down with the savages down to Apache country. And just thinking about how small Indian world is, real quickly, a story off topic. I had to go, when I was deployed to Afghanistan back in 2009, 2010, I had to go look for a man named Bo Bergdahl. He was a soldier that deserted our unit. And so that was my unit that he deserted.
Wow.
So as he deserted our unit, we had to go out and we had to go look for him. And we were out there for just over 4 weeks. So we're talking about 29 days that we were out there looking for Bo Bergdahl. While we were out there, you know, my platoon, which is airborne platoon, ended up linking up with this other platoon, which is, you know, not airborne. They're a completely different element, but still we were there looking for Bo Bergdahl. And so as a forward observer, I went with the platoon leader everywhere, the company commander. And company commander, once we linked up with this other platoon, said, all right, Lee, go link up with their forward observer, find out which fires plans you need to go over. And so I went out and I started, you know, trying to find this other forward observer. I ended up finding him, and I ended up realizing as well, this guy is Native American. Holy smokes, you know? And so there's two of us, two Native Americans way out there in the middle of Afghanistan, you know, we were supposed to talk about fires plans. We didn't talk about fires plans. We talked about powwows. We talked about, you know, the foods that we had missed. We talked about, you know, our family and everything, all of those cultural things that we were missing out on, you know. And I asked him, like, you ever miss out on your child's birth? He's like, no, I don't have any children yet, you know, but one of those things that we talked about, you know, that identity, you know. And so when we talk to our children about going out and venturing out into the world, you know, we let them know you're going to wear multiple caps. You know, you could become a firefighter, you could become a doctor, you could become a lawyer, you could become a person that works with the attorney general, you could become, you know, all of these things that you're able to do in life. And so we send them out, you know, but always remember that first thing that you are, you're Native American. One of the things that I've been emphasizing a lot lately is that of the entire world, 8.5 billion populated world, there are only 12,000 Yakama. And so understanding that big difference, if we was to look at your body and understand that this body was 8.5 billion people and only this part, this much is Yakama, you know, and realize that that number, you know, and one of the other things that I speak about is our wash-up belief where, you know, I officiate Sunday service at a Toppenish Creek Longhouse of the Washat faith. You know, the Washat faith extends north up to the Canadian border, down to South Central Oregon, all the way over to the Idaho border and northwest corner of the Oregon border. And so of the Washat faith, 8.5 billion people that, you know, that are in this world, of that 8.5 billion, we know that 12,000 are Yakama that can practice this Washat faith. You know, and then we have Warm Springs, we have Umatilla, we have Colville, we have Nez Perce, we have Spokane, all have that ability to practice this Washat faith. You know, and that's not a big number. We're looking probably about 25,000-ish, you know, if we were to add all those numbers up. And so maintaining, understanding that identity, you know, not just the language itself, you know, as we had spoken to Mark a couple of days ago, of the Yakama Nation, we are broken down into 14 different bands. And of those 14 different bands, there are 14 different dialects of languages that are spoken of those 14 different bands. When we come together, we speak one, which we call Sahaptin. But nonetheless, as we branch out, all of those different bands have their own, you know, dialect of language as well. If you break down those bands, and each of those families that make up those bands all as well have their own dialect and their own teaching and their own understanding. And so when we look at, you know, the genealogies, as was brought up, you know, we are broken down way more than just understanding of Yakama Nation. We are of the Skimpa band of, you know, this family, or we are of the Klickitat band of this family, you know, we are Walla Walla, you know, we come from this band. And so so when we speak about identity and going out there, you know, we always tell our children, remember who you are first. You're Indian first, you're Native first, you're Yakama first, you're Skimpa first, you're Klickitat first, you know, all of these different things. And so we don't say, you know, don't allow anyone, you try to open up everyone, so that everyone's able to understand all of these different teachings and how they could benefit, how they will not benefit as well, you know, and so that we can carry ourselves in that manner of always understanding where we come from, you know, who our grandparents are, who our great-grandparents are, and those teachings, and understanding that as we move forward in this world, it is them that we are carrying forth into the future. And so,
yeah, on the culturally sensitive DNA question, I take your point about cultural diversity and the tradition I come out of, the Jewish tradition. I mean, Jews spend most of their time arguing with one another, of course, including around DNA. Because there's also a deep feeling, as Asa mentioned, that there's bodily integrity, and that in as much as we are created in the image of Creator, we should return in that form. So, but there is a rabbinical teaching now. This has come up a lot in excavations around Holocaust sites, where there's such a desire by the family to know how our loved ones died. And my family, we've recently discovered the burial ground of my father's father's father, who was murdered in the Holocaust. And there is a big sort of debate. There's rabbinic consultation about would it be appropriate to extract the DNA from the human remains to confirm what is believed. And the current thinking is that if there were scattered teeth, that would be all right. In other words, if the Lord had allowed some separation from the body, then it would be appropriate respectfully to extract DNA from the dentition, from the teeth, but not from the core body. So that's the sort of, everybody's exploring at this point. But,
I think as a task force, we're a task force founded on community, families, relatives. You know, that's our foundation. And they make recommendations from the task force, and it's policy oriented task force. And so I kind of, you know, whatever recommendation we have, it's going to be founded in what George talked about. He's talking about it's going to be founded in that. So whatever policy we have around cultural sensitivity, cultural understanding, it's going to come from the community. And so, and that's what's really crazy about the task force is our policy people that do this work, they're the ones writing it. And so I can foresee this, you know, as a new policy moving forward that the task force is gonna recommend. And so I can't say right now what that is, but it's gonna be founded in where we come from. And written in a way that's understandable by, you know, as a state-wide policy recommendation. And so moving in that direction, you know, well, what does that mean? You know, well, in Washington State, we're pretty good in working with tribes for the most part, compared to the union. We have a centennial court that's happening next week, where tribes meet with the governor and talk about policy issues. We have a RCW that recognizes government relations and how you need a tribal liaison in every state agency, and how you have a millennial agreement that kind of frames how we do this together. And so based on those three things, you know, Allison, Dr. Brooks, you know, she's a phone call away from me, and I can call her up and ask her, hey, what's your thoughts on this? And that happened in the past a couple of times. And so, you know, so some of these things that are new, you know, if we need to get ahead of it and write a policy about it, you know, in Washington State, at least, we can do that. And so I'll probably go back to the task force and ask them, like, hey, what are our thoughts around this now that we've gone through a DNA process, right? And so we need to figure that out. So that's a good question.
So we have two things to do, our final thanks, and we're going to ask George to say a few words, if he would share some words of wisdom. And I know some of you have to rush off, but we do want to thank our panelists for coming up from the Yakama Nation. Anything?
Just really quick.
Yeah.
Again, I work for the Attorney General. I'm the tribal liaison for the AG's office, also on the task force. I did bring some reports from this last year. I have a bunch more in my car I couldn't bring because I got so many. And so at least check out these reports that I have with me today. And check out our website. We have like a lot of reports coming out this year. So really, it's all in the data, you know? And so really drive that point from
And thanks, of course, to AIS, thanks to the museum team, to Carissa and to Lynn, and to everyone, and to all of you here and online for being part of this. And finally, I'd like to ask George if we could share some words to send us off in a good way.
Wakana Anshafi, Lakna Mayanowe, Al Etitamat Nimi Sinwit, and Imiwanak Shashtamnak Wakishwit. I want to thank you guys again for making your way here as you're able to take in those words that we have shared that come from our heart, our body, our spirit. As we talk about our loved ones, we understand there's difficulty that comes with it. There's a lot of times where within our traditional belief, we don't speak about our loved ones anymore. We allow them to move on. But we understand the necessity of having to carry and advocate for our loved ones in this pandemic that we understand as our loved ones are moving forward in. Understand that as well, we have children that we are understanding will move on in this world without us as parents. And so we do our best to advocate so that we can leave that better world behind for our children so they're and take care of it upon their responsibility. And so as we move forward, we pray that each and every one of us, you know, understanding the stories that have come out, understanding the challenges that have been shown to each and every one of you, as you don't understand a lot of the challenges that we must overcome. But you're able to pray now and understand that as these challenges step in the way of what we call justice, that we're able to benefit in a way that will see these families, each and every one of them, as you had heard, 110 cold cases here within the state of Washington alone. And so that we pray that that justice is able to be fulfilled for those families left behind. That you're able to carry a prayer, not only for the benefit of your future, but as a community, as we come together as that community. No different than our community, we understand, we pray for one another. And so we want to allow that prayer from each and every one of you to benefit this work as well. And so we want to thank each and every one of you for making your way here to benefit, you know, the testimonies and the stories that have come out. I want to thank each and every one of you for opening your ears, opening your heart, opening your spirit to allow these words in. These, like I said, these things are, these challenges that we have in our life, missing and murdered, affect a lot of many people, not just us. And so we want to keep that prayer going strong for our missing and murdered. I want to thank the museum here for allowing us the opportunity to get up and speak. And again, for you opening your ears and your hearts for our stories.
Then your son's here too.
My son is enrolled here at Central Washington. His name is Kamaya Kinley. And so he's a freshman here.
We have we'd like to present some gifts to you all for coming and being with us.
Just teasing around, okay, that's all I'm saying. That means that Ace is from Pennsylvania.
That's what I heard, right? That's what I heard.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, there's a connection somewhere in there.
Somebody.
Hey.
Probably some of those Canadian French that went down to Pennsylvania and moved back this way.
What's those religious people out there?
The Amish ones.
Amish, maybe it's Amish.
Yeah, Shakers
Nice.
so far away, so.
Tell everyone.
So thank you so much for coming and for sharing your stories, sharing your sadness, sharing the difficulties that you all have faced and your expertise and moving forward.